So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk again. And I think Michael Langenstein is joining us from New York City. So welcome to him as well. And nice to see some familiar faces again. So I'm going to talk to you today about something, my collecting interest has always been India and the subcontinent, Pakistan, from where I'm from, and Sri Lanka. But in the over the years of collecting, I've developed specific interests, and one of them is the handmade postcard. And this has mainly been going to these postcard meetings, up here and elsewhere in the U.S. and discovering Chinese handmade postcards, then Indian handmade postcards, and most recently Native American handmade postcards. And I tried to put them all together in this presentation, and I wrote a little article about them, which I will share the link for with about as well. But I think the two things to keep in mind when we think about a handmade postcard, we're thinking about a postcard where actually people's hands have done most of the work on that postcard. And the two things to keep in mind that are common between China, India, and Native America here, and by Native America, I mean this United States, Native Americans living in the United States, referred to as Indians in those days. Two things. Labor was cheap, so there was a lot of time that people could put into making these postcards. And there were really some great artistic traditions, which I would like to describe in my presentation, that people used to make these postcards. So just to refresh our minds for a second as to where the postcards came from, we're talking about the late 1890s. In the top right corner, greetings from South India. That's one of my earliest postcards from India. That's from 1896. That's a lithograph. On the left side, I think it's about 1901, is a hand-painted postcard from China, where actually the drawing is hand-painted. And in the bottom right, I think it's more like 1903, 1904. It's Native Americans, but it's hand-painted on the postcard, which was a printed postcard. So there was already the thing that we all know and we as collectors know about postcards, that they were mass reproduced. There were lithographs, there were collotypes, there were halftones, real photographs, all sorts of different ones. But the handmade postcard is a tiny fraction of the larger market. And what I want to do here is talk about first the handmade postcard in China, then India, and then Native America. So this is the back of almost all Chinese handmade postcards. This is actually an undivided back type postcard, but for some reason, this was the same type of back that was then used on the handmade postcards, even well into the period that these postcards were made. I think somebody sort of copied them. So this is probably the most typical handmade Chinese postcard. Basically, what they did was take stamps, use stamps, cut them up based on color and design, and then paste them on a postcard front. Put a little bit of water paint on it, like you can see a boat in the background. That is a water painted boat. The gray of the water in the front is water painted, but the rest of it is stamps. And then they take out like the Statue of Liberty or a figure from an American stamp, and then they'll use the postmark cancellations and draw these black lines to give you the sense of a sail being hoisted or whatever. But the key thing to note is the fine cutting, the adding of some watercolor to sort of fulfill the whole thing. You can see the guy at the bottom left having this big oar that's drawn in. So it took a lot of work to make a postcard like this. Now, people had templates. It's not that these were complete one-off postcards. So there were many kind of boat postcards. For example, here's another one where you have a very similar, have a woman in the front of the boat. You have the same colors, of the stamps at the top. By the way, these were some of the earliest stamps of China, that were made when it became a republic. Some had Sun Yat-sen on them. Some had this Chinese called junk, but actually it's a Chinese boat there. So these are the stamps that were then once used, people used again to make into a postcard. And I find this, I must say, I find this one of the most amazing traditions of postcard making, reusing stamps in such a creative way, using the colors, using stamps from all over the world. And you can see some of the figures that were done. I mean, on the left is a man, carrying a fish or something. On the right is a grandmother holding a staff with a little bird and hen that is also, created. So I want to move this over a little bit so I can see myself where you've got sort of the rest of the room there. And then you have Sun Yat-sen, who was the first president of China, I think as of 1912 or 1914, right until the early 20s, right here. So that had to do with the overthrow of the Qing dynasty. So it was a really big moment in Chinese history when these stamps were put on. And you will find very, very few of these postcards have stamps from the imperial dynasty, because they're all stamps used from, much more modern times. And there's a sense of, even as these postcards are reaching back to tradition, also being very modern. So here we see other examples. There's a fisherman here on the right. You see the little swan here, all cut up in postcards. You have, I thought this was a boy chasing to catch a frisbee, but no, this is actually plates, left on as they're doing through the water. Now, I want to say that the collage tradition in China goes back thousands of years. There was a long tradition, as you know, paper was invented by the Chinese. There's a long tradition of cutting up paper and making collage, and women were especially good at this. And they did this in villages as well. When you had certain festivities and you had lanterns put up, women would cut out all the paper that went into the lanterns. So it's important to realize that this kind of a art form was in many ways built upon some earlier traditions that were already there in China. And from what I mean, postcards, handmade postcards existed in the States as well. In France, you can find actually quite a few sometimes, but nowhere was it developed into a tradition the way the Chinese developed it. And that makes it to me very interesting and a very finely developed tradition. So here you see on the left, you have a rickshaw puller pulling a woman in a rickshaw. On the bottom is a boy playing with a ball. On the right is a really cool card, which has arrived safely. And you can see that, a woman. So one thing to notice is that the woman on the left in the rickshaw is actually Queen Wilhelmina of Holland. And this is because her face there comes from a Dutch stamp. And in those days, Indonesia was a Dutch colony. And Indonesia being quite close to China, and there being many Chinese people in Indonesia, and stamps being sent back and forth from Dutch Indonesia, her figure and her face as a woman's face, you will see on many of these postcards. So what they did was, when stamps came in, people actually took the stamps and cut them out and reused them and used the colors and the different designs on the stamp to create something new. And I find that really an interesting thing to do. The boy playing with a ball is another type. So my sense is that you had a little bit of a manufacturing workshop where you had people cutting up the stamps, then you had people pasting the stamps on and making them into different shapes, and people who had made the drawing and so forth. So there was probably a bit of an assembly line going on, and you had basic designs that were then followed by people. It's not that the Chinese could not at that time make painted postcards. If you look on the left side, at the very top postcard there is actually a handmade postcard, but it's a silk. There's a piece of silk over the card, and then they've painted a drawing onto the silk. And at the bottom where it says China 1905, that's a painted Chinese gate. That's a painted postcard. So they were totally able to paint postcards or use silk postcards, do other things, but they chose the stamped postcard. The postcard on the right, Chinese Girl, is one of my absolute favorites because it is so creative. Most of the girl is a watercolor drawn, but you see the strips going down her, top and her skirt. Those are actually bits of stamps cut in very thin lines going down, which I find just an amazingly creative way of using these kinds of things. I should say that most of the postcards that I have, stamped postcards from China, start around 1920, 1923. Supposedly, a fellow called Xiao Lengxiang, who was like the secretary to one of the warlord presidents of China at the time, was really into this and trying to reuse stamps. And there are stories that I've had translated from Chinese press that he actually began the tradition, but my feeling is that it may have actually arisen in many different places. Now, these are women. These are actually for the Japanese market. There were a lot of Japanese tourists who would come to China in those days. As you know, Japan had invaded China earlier. They invaded again in the 1930s. There was a lot of obviously Japanese people coming, and these were like geisha girls who were then made on into postcards using the stamps again and then sold to Japanese tourists. The one on the left where you see that little XY seems to be an artist's signature. I have, I don't know Chinese. I've been working with some translators, so I haven't read enough of the press and I don't know enough about the history. And actually, there's virtually nothing written about Chinese handmade postcards, even from what I've been able to find hiring Chinese researchers. But it seems as if there was so much turmoil in China in those days that many artists lost their jobs and got into this craft of making postcards using stamps because they could make money that way. So as in Japan, where also in the late 19th century during the Meiji era, a lot of artists lost their jobs and their traditional jobs. They actually got into postcard design, and the Japanese have some very fine postcards, as you know. So women were a very popular subject here. They were also a popular subject in calendar art in China as of 1910. It had to do with women's liberation and emancipation and so forth, although these are geisha examples and slightly different. This is one made for the US market. So if you look carefully, you can just see how cleverly they've taken US postage stamps. I think it's George Washington here on the top. There's Florence Nightingale, I think here having to do with the Red Cross's anniversary. On the right, they fashioned a chair. I think that might be Benjamin Franklin. They've, created this little spinning wheel here. There's an iron. There's some cooking pots. Again, the color is cool. It just looks like a drawing room. May have looked in an American, house in the Midwest in those days, or who knows where. So I think the level of sort of creativity and innovation is really, really high. This is a card. So I will say this. When the communists came to power in the later 40s, this postcard tradition sort of died, and even by the late 30s and so forth, it had finished. So this is a card that was actually mailed from LA. I think it was made in China because there were Chinatowns everywhere, and you had Chinese people, I'm sure in San Francisco as well as Los Angeles and other places, making the cards. They were part of a diaspora. But this card has a very interesting little message on the bottom. It was sent from LA in 1940, and it says, "Greetings from a synthetic China city, Los Angeles. Another place for the dumb tourist to spend his dough, MS." So, people are making jokes and using these cards as well. But this is actually the Temple of Heaven in Beijing, which is sort of represented here in this sort of three-domed kind of a structure here, just using stamps in the middle to give the body of the Summer Palace temple of Heaven. So these are two cards that I got. These are, just sort of interesting cards from Lynn Ronghua Farago, who some of you may know, and Marty Michaels, who I think some of you may know as well, was a big help to me in sort of finding these cards and thinking about them. On the left, you see a pagoda, which this might be one of the pagodas, which is sort of well known in China, with a little boat floating in the front. And on the right is a Chinese woman somehow crucified. We don't quite understand the context. I don't really know what it's supposed to mean or something, but it's certainly an arresting and startling card. So once again, there was a sort of sense of using things and making things in many different ways. So once I collected, 100 or so of these cards, I started thinking about like, what could the artistic traditions be behind it? And sorry, before that, let me just show you. This is Sun Yat-sen, who was very common and popular in these cards. He was the popular, elected sort of first president of China. And here he's being carried in a rickshaw. You see many of these cards where his, face from the stamp is right in the middle of the rickshaw as if he's being carried by the card. This is a, woman giving flowers to probably somebody who's wooing her, down by a window. And this is another card I picked up from Lynn Farago's collection as well, which is, I don't quite know what it is, but it seems to be a man or a woman looking at themselves in a mirror in some way. I'm not sure, but it seems rather clever with this sort of steep angle as well, and a lot of watercolor. So I began a communication with Nancy Berliner, who is an expert on Chinese painting in the 19th century and early 20th century at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And she's written a fantastic book called The Eight Brokens, which had to do with Chinese art during this period. And since China was going through so much turmoil, being invaded by different countries and so forth, an art form took off, which is kind of like collage, where people painted, like if you look at the bottom left drawing, these are tickets, these are pieces of paper, these are bronze rubbings, this is text written, a long time ago, bits of poetry. So this sense of using collage and using bits of paper and painting them or pasting them on something, even on a fan, painted on a fan in the top left. All of these things are from the late 19th century, early 20th century, was already a tradition in China. So I think that this collage postcard tradition may have evolved in some way from that tradition. And I think that's kind of an interesting way of trying to connect previous art and later art. And the focus on it, of course, is something being broken. Now, I like to think, and I can't get into the mind of these artists and so forth, and don't quite know what they were thinking. But I sometimes wonder if the postcard artists who are using all these Western stamps in their country and cutting them up and pasting them on a postcard and having them sent out again, were not saying something like, "Hey, we can do better than you with this stuff. You've got these old stamps, you've used these stamps, but we can actually reappropriate them and make something that is uniquely our own around them." And that, could be something that makes it kind of interesting to me. We should also say that this is the time when Picasso and George Braque were inventing the art of collage painting. On the right is a Picasso from 1913 or so, and on the left is George Braque. These are both, these are big museum people and so forth. And, both of these artists, and this was part of the modernist movement in Europe as well, was to use collage, to use bits of paper, to paint them, to, cut things up as, Picasso did and Braque on the left as well. So this is kind of part of the world in a way, sort of, disassembling itself and then reassembling itself in another way. Finally, I'll end with on the China section with a very interesting Chinese artist called Xiao Shao Tang. What he did was take stamps and make unique paintings. And on the left side is a painting called The Great Dragon in 1971, where he used 4,800 stamps to recreate a dragon. And on the right is The God of Happiness, which is like 1,200 stamps. That is what he gave as a gift to Picasso in 1971, on I think Picasso's 90th birthday or 80th birthday, as a gift to thank him for all of the inspiration that he had made. So this is, of course, not quite a postcard. This is a much bigger piece, but it's using stamps as well. But it shows again how this tradition of cutting and using stamps and using them for their color and creating something new out of them was kind of a big thing, and something that sort of fit into many Chinese traditions, both old and new. Let's turn to India for a second. So that was China. And now let's come to India, which is, of course, as you know, my collecting, passion and what I've done most of my work on. This is the back of an Indian card, undivided, back card. And this, again, this tradition in India, if the Chinese tradition was stamped postcards, is more, I think, from the early 1920s on. I've yet to find something convincingly from an earlier period. The Indian tradition starts around 1906. 1903, 1904, and it's painted. So they're not stamped cards, these are painted cards. So here's one example where they've painted a drawing of a woman and a man on a camel, and then the humorous caption at the bottom written in pencil is "high class people." This is another one showing, again, painted, a family, a family on an ox cart, traveling. And I think these both are made in Bombay, but this one could be from Jaipur as well. And here's a woman shoemaker shown with all the goods, around her. And this is all hand painted watercolor by Indian artists. And this is now we're getting more into the sort of religious side of these cards. This is Lakshmi, the wife of Vishnu, a goddess of fortune. I think this caption was written by an American or an English woman who had bought this card and then, sent it and collected it. But you can look at the meticulous, painting that is being done on a single card here. This is certainly the work of a craftsperson. And this is a card also painted from, I think this is from Calcutta because this is the goddess Durga, who is, known for her sort of bloodthirsty nature. She's the destroyer of demons and so forth, and very much a goddess of Calcutta. Now, Chinese stamped postcards are much easier to find than these hand-painted cards of China. In fact, it's very hard to find these cards today when they come up on market on auction. There are many Indians who are trying to buy them. So I don't have that many. I don't buy that many, when they come up because they're just so infrequently does one find them. This is the closest to a Chinese hand-painted Chinese stamp postcard that I can find in the Indian tradition. It says made by natives and consisting of all kinds of animals and then hand drawn and painted. But it looks sort of like a stamp postcard in the sense you have all these animals on this horse. You have some kind of animal riding the horse. You have a little boy back here on towards the rear. So it's a very actually creative construction, and a very unique card as far as I can tell from India. This is one of the most interesting cards to me because on the very top, you see a printed halftone card. And this was a postcard made by an Indian painter called M.V. Durandar, who was one of the great Indian painters around the 20th century. And he actually produced, we think it might have been for the Indian Postal Service, 1903, 1904, about 70 cards, which I have collected. And one of them is Ghati, which is, a sort of lower class women grinding corn. At the bottom is a hand painted copy of his card by an artist, which is so identical to what he has done up there. And the bottom card is from 1904, and it's dated there. So basically, you can see that you have exactly the same basket. You have the two women's hands on exactly the same thing, grinding the corn. You have almost the same expressions on their face. So it's really, it's something to consider when you think about the fact that the painter at the bottom is copying a card by a famous artist and making a hand-painted postcard out of that. I find that really quite unusual and unexpected. So once again, there are roots in this tradition in earlier Indian art. So the top two images here are hand-painted postcards, but all across the bottom are what is known as company paintings, which are usually about 4 by 6, or could be much bigger, but they're typically almost just a slightly bit bigger than postcards. They're company paintings where handmade paintings made largely for European visitors during the time of the East India Company, starting in the late 18th century, pretty much through the mid, early, certainly big in the early 19th and towards the middle of the 19th century. And then they became too expensive to make. They were made on ivory or, camel bone or paper and so forth. But you can see how very similarly you have a figure, some kind of a person who's being isolated from their background or shown with the tools of their trade. So just like in the Chinese tradition, I think there are roots of this handmade stamped collage postcard in various Chinese art forms. So I think also in India, you have these kinds of roots in earlier painting traditions. And given the way that painters, survived for generations, it's quite possible that some of these artists who made the hand-painted postcards came from people who had made East India Company type paintings in earlier generations. And again, just like in China, where it was in Shanghai, where a lot of these postcard traditions of these postcards were made. And because that's where foreigners came, these were the big port cities. It was Bombay and Calcutta and maybe even Chennai, Madras, where these traditions then arose, and then people made the hand-painted postcards. Now, what I wanted to do was just go through a couple of the similar types of cards in the Chinese tradition and the Indian tradition. So on the left, on the top, you see Chinese stamped collage postcard, Sun Yat-sen, you can recognize in the middle of the man's body fighting a snake. And the bottom is a painted Indian postcard of a man trying to charm a snake with music. Here you see two different women at the spinning wheel. As I said, Queen Wilhelmina is the head, of course, because that was the most common stamp to get. Here she's spinning cotton, and here you see a painted postcard of an Indian woman spinning cotton. And here you see a man hunting storks in China. And then here you see a man hunting tigers in India, painted. And here you see a woman on the right is a geisha. On the left, you see at the very top, it's a dancing woman. And at the bottom is a Muslim bride being taken and her face is covered. So I think it's interesting in the sense that many of these cards were sold to foreigners who visited these places, or they were mailed, by people who lived there back to their relatives, often in the US, but Europe as well. But you had certain types, the hunter, women who looked, very different, given that they had very different clothing and so forth. So you had a certain sense of trying to find the exotic type, the kind of person who was different from the people that were known, in Western civilization, and trying to show those cards off to people. This is another sort of interesting the sort of angle on the Indian painted postcard. On the very left is a postcard. It's signed by A. Ghasiram, who was actually a famous painter in a place called Natwara, which is in Rajasthan, where you had a really great tradition of Hindu devotional art being painted by a number of painters. So to make a postcard on the left, what happened was you had Ghasiram's painting, somebody photographed it, sent the photograph to Germany, where a bromide postcard was made. That postcard was sent back to India to Bridge Basi and Sons, who then hand painted the postcard, hand tinted the postcard with the red and the green and all of that, and then sold that postcard in the market. So you had again, a multiple sort of level of painting and printing, sort of combining. The same strategy was used on the right, which is actually an actual picture of a kid who was then rechristened as Lord Krishna, who's a Hindu god, painted, again, printed as a bromide. There's some temples at the bottom that you can see, printed as a bromide, brought back from Germany, and then hand painted. And then glitter was also applied. You can barely see, but there's a lot of glitter around the oval, around the necklaces and so forth. So they put this 3D glitter on top of the hand painted, or let's say hand illustrated postcard. So you had many different varieties, coming up here of people trying to show the way they could use postcards and make them even more beautiful and creative. I've only so far found one Indian stamped type collage postcard. This is a scene from Agra, and they've used British Indian stamps in the top left to sort of put the picture of the British king on top of the domes of what I think is, if I remember correctly, is a mosque, or I think a pavilion within Agra Fort. So this is the only Indian stamped collage postcard that I've found so far. Maybe there are more, and maybe people were influenced by that kind of art, but I think it's just I wanted to share this with you. This is also a completely hand-painted postcard, very nicely done. It could be by a major Indian artist. This actually could be by somebody like Durandar, although there is no sign, no signature to it. And it looks like a Maharaja who was in the army of some sort, some kind of soldier, so maybe a rich man. But again, a very nicely done, completely hand-painted watercolor postcard. And lest you think this tradition is dead, actually, you can on eBay find many cards like this, where what they've done is taken an old card from in this case from 1904, and then painted over half of it a new painting. So this tradition of hand painting postcards continues in India today. Of course, they're more expensive than regular postcards, but it's quite a nice painting on the left. And it's it's a watercolor, and it's all done by hand. So it's not yet a dead tradition at all in India, which I find kind of interesting. So let's turn to Native America for a second, because the other place that I found a tradition of handmade postcards is Native America. And this is, we're talking here about obviously American Indian tribes starting in the 1890s. I mean, it's very interesting to me that at the time, in the late 1890s, there were about 250,000 Native Americans left in this whole country. So that's about a third of the population of San Francisco. Now there are maybe, maybe I think it's 4 or 5 million, but in those days there were very few people, Native Americans left in this country, and still there was a tradition of making some kind of a handmade postcard, which I will share with you now. Here's one from 1906. So the Native American handmade postcard tradition is very brief, and it's more like 1906 till 1909, because these leather postcards were then banned by the US Postal Service because they gummed up the machines that were used to sort the mail. So they were banned, more or less. You can still buy them in tourist shops today, and they still make them in some places, but those are mass produced. Now, how these postcards were made, and obviously I think templates were used, is that they took a piece of leather, which is very much a traditional form that Native Americans worked with, and then used a burin, a burnt sort of metal piece, to then make a drawing into it. In this case of an Indian chieftain, it might be Sitting Bull, I'm not sure. And then afterwards it was painted. And you'll see these little tick marks on the left, I think especially, and the right. Those little tick marks are also indicators that this was handmade, to show that it was actually not just completely, that it was not, machine made. So it's basically drawing with a hot little iron bit on leather that you get this drawing, and then you add some kind of paint to it. And I'm just going to show you some pieces of leather in different ways that they were used in Native American traditions. On the left, you have a piece of leather with some, drawings, again, using this iron, canoe and bow and arrow and so forth. But then a postcard actually pasted into the middle, which was a printed postcard. On the bottom, you have a thinking of home postcard, and you have actually, for the tent, the wigwam, you actually have a piece of leather put there. And in the top right, and some of you might be most familiar with this, is that Native Americans made beautiful postcard album covers and photograph album covers in leather, and then they would put a drawing on it, and sometimes write as on the one in the top right, postcards on it, and then people would collect postcards in them. Sometimes when I find something on eBay, I like the album cover, so I buy that. And it takes a lot of room in my closet, but it's still quite nice because they're obviously quite unique. Now, many of these postcards were, of course, made for people who visited Indian reservations to send back to people. So it's, white people coming, and then you have some of these, postcards are obviously, some of them are a bit racist, some of them trying to make jokes and all of that, but then people write messages on them. So here I'm as busy as an Indian trying to, light a fire. And then I'm an Indian on the spot. The right one is kind of a nicer drawing, but the color is a bit faded. It was supposed to be Pocahontas. And then I'm being well entertained. It's like sending it from a reservation or not able to tear myself away. There were a lot of these humorist, somewhat racist cards made as well. Red and green being the most common dyes available cheaply there. Many of these cards are actually colored that way as well. This one has a nice little phrase on it. This was a common card. The Indian with his pipe of peace has slowly passed away, but the Irishman with his piece of pipe has come prepared to stay. So, some of these must have been printed in a sort of maybe mass way, and then hand colored. I'm not entirely sure. I haven't been able to figure that out. But I will notice that I think that it would have been Native Americans on the reservation who colored these in, because you may notice that the Indian figure actually is much more nicely colored than the Irishman. So maybe they're trying to undermine the message in some way. This is from 1904. There are a number of these cards about, why don't you write, or something is trying to show some kind of a drunken, Native American in the top left. This was a tradition, unfortunately, that also existed for cards from India. On the right, you have Master's Whiskey, showing an Indian servant who's drunk too much. These kinds of cards only are from South India, actually. And this one printer, Higginbotham and Company in Madras, which actually is still there as a bookseller. I visited them but a few months ago. And on the left is an opium den, I think in San Francisco. So you had this tradition also of postcards depicting the people, whether Indians, Chinese, or Native Americans, in kind of a negative way, having drunken too much or consuming some kind of drug. These are very interesting cards to me in the sense that there is this big story among Northeast American Indians, Native Americans, about Hiawatha being a great figure who brought together the Iroquois tribes, 5 tribes, and created a unified, quote, Indian nation in those days. So you have cards celebrating Hiawatha when he came to his people, almost like a Jesus Christ figure in the top left. And at the bottom, you're showing Hiawatha, and then you're showing his wife, Minnehaha, who was, I think, killed by some other tribe, but also is a figure in all of this. So some of these cards also celebrated some of the Indian heroes. And that slowly became a part of these cards as well, which I find, kind of interesting. And it's a way of the people sort of speaking back and letting their own opinions be heard. These are some more postcard album covers that I talked to you about, hand painted and then, drawn in with the burin. At the very bottom, I think it's from 1908. They also made little Indian moccasins, which were then a little tag was put on it with a stamp, and it would be mailed and taken in the mail system, so you could mail that out. So if you go to Native American reservations today, you still can find these little moccasins, but you can't, I don't think, attach them in the same way and send them as a postcard, as a souvenir. And here is this this thing. I mean, to me, what was interesting about this postcard album sign is the swastika sign, which actually is a sign that Native Americans use, and people use it in India as well. Going back 4,000 or 5,000 years. So it's a strange congruence of motifs. And then, again, Native Americans could paint cards too. They didn't have to use leather. I think these were probably made by Native American artists, a man who called himself Bob here. But it's quite, these are completely hand painted postcards, and they seem to have all sorts of details as to the Native Americans, tribe or whatever other meaning can be ascribed to the signs in the lapels and on the clothes. So this is probably the most interesting card that I got. This is a Hiawatha, I told you was the hero of the Native American. This is like the 10th, 11th century. Here on a stamp collage postcard, you can see the stamps, especially on the left card at the very bottom. But George Washington's face from a stamp is the face of Hiawatha. So this is really a combination of many different traditions. It's quite possible that this was done maybe by Native American artists. I'm not sure. Could it have been done by, Chinese people who made these cards and knew that they could, sell these to some people who were visiting Native American reservations? I'm not sure. But this sort of mixture of George Washington, hand painting, a Native American tradition, and so forth, all together in one card, sort of brings together all of these traditions in one way. So that's it. That's really my talk that I wanted to share with you. Many thanks, Marty Michaels, Lynn Fargo. I mentioned there are a couple of other scholars who sort of helped me out. I've put my website there. And I will try and share with you later on. I wrote an article about these postcards for the International Association of Asian Studies, which goes over just Chinese and Native American postcards in a little more detail. And I will try and get that link in the chat to you while you're asking some questions in case you want to, read any more stuff about this.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for that, Omar. I enjoyed every bit of it.
Okay.
That was great.
My pleasure. So let me start by just answering Lynn's question here, which is, I I I mean, I've only been to China once and I did not find any postcards on my visit there. And most of the Indian postcards I always buy abroad because India's climate is really bad for keeping postcards. So when I go to India and try and buy postcards, and I've gone to the markets there, they invariably or mostly have little holes in them from white ants and the humidity. So they're really hard to get those kinds of cards there. I'm sure there are some collectors, and sometimes I do get them, maybe kept in an album or something. But most of these cards from China and also from India, I have bought abroad, mainly in the US, but also the UK and Europe.
They're all beautiful cards. The one question that I had, or really was amazed at, is the accuracy of the paintings that you showed, mainly from the Indian cards that you were showing. Uh, they were so accurate on such a small format. Uh, there's some marvelous artists out there, aren't there?
Absolutely. There are some really great artists. And I think that's been part of the fun for me in sort of discovering all of this has been just learning about the artists, learning about the incredible stuff that they did. You're right. It's really quite something. It's really an amazing sort of thing that they've been doing. What are the general prices of these kinds of cards? Are they very expensive? Yes, I think a good Indian hand painted card can easily go to 100, $200. I think the Chinese stamp postcards, the nicer ones, can also go 40 to 200, something like that, and maybe around 100 often. So yeah, they are expensive. They're more expensive than most cards, and they're much harder to find. I
Uh,
think one can get Chinese cards a little bit cheaper too. It depends on, whatever the situation, but yeah, they're expensive.
I heard your talk when you did it for the San Francisco Club,
Uh-huh.
and I have a memory of, I think you said that you have to be careful with some of the cards. Maybe it's the hand painted ones that there can be counterfeits.
Yes.
I was wondering if you would refresh my memory about that.
Yes. You remember the very last Indian card I showed you was a modern card that was made. So yes, you can have those counterfeits and that's trying to be a counterfeit because they advertise themselves as being from 1904. So you have to be careful and sort of look at the back and so forth. So I think so far I've been okay. I've not been fooled. And it's not that it's I mean it's a little difficult to counterfeit as well, in the sense you have to put a lot of effort into it if it's hand painted. But yes, you're right. One has to be a little careful for sure. I think for the stamped cards from China, I think they're very hard to counterfeit. So where do you get the stamps, right? So by the way, I forgot to say one of the reasons that the stamped postcard from China went out of favor was they ran out of stamps. And even the postcard artist who I showed you about, who had made those big paintings for Picasso, he said, I used 1 million stamps in my career. There are no more stamps. And he also said, by the way, and another thing I forgot to mention is the glue is essential to those cards, the Chinese stamp postcards. And he said, the artist said that his secret sauce was his glue. That's what made it so good. But I find on these stamp postcards too, the glue is amazing. I hardly ever have a card where a stamp is peeling off. Like the glue has held for a century. So it's really quite something when you come to think about, the level of intelligence that went into this.
I wanted to ask about the leather cards. I have a bunch of those. They used to make cushions out of them. Are they mostly made by Indians, by native peoples? Or
So,
who made all those leather cards?
so that's a great question, Don. I think that Indian people probably made a lot of them, but I'm not absolutely sure. I think some of the nicer painted ones were made by Indian people on reservations or living next to a reservation.
They all are painted individually, I guess.
Yes, yes, they are painted individually and then they're drawn individually, too. I mean, there might have been some kind of stencil that burnt in
I've
some.
never known what to think about my bunch and whether they have any value or does anybody collect them specially? I don't know.
I think they do. I mean, I sometimes buy them on eBay. Do send me pictures. I would love to see what you have. I'm always, I've occasionally buy really beautiful ones. Uh, And those ones I think were made by, my guess is they were made by Indian artists. But I'm not 100% sure, and I think this is a subject that needs further research.
I don't intend to sell any of them. I think
Okay.
they're very interesting.
Yeah. But I would love to see them. I would just love to see them if at some point.
Omar, how many cards do you think Lynn has? How many stamp art cards?
You know, I got them from her 2 years ago, 2023, and I think she had like 500 to 1,000, something like that, because her husband had passed away, and she was
Yeah, I had met Nick. He was a fabulous guy.
Yeah, I hear he was a really good collector of these. By the way, they had the most amazing collection of these, and I learned a lot from their collection, and I bought a number. I don't know how many she has now. I don't know how many are left, and so forth. But that was a really interesting collection because they had great taste, and they bought within sectors, like certain types of cards, and you'd have 7 or 10 examples. So I was able to actually start working backwards and understanding the kinds of templates that people used.
Wow.
Were all these cards you showed of standard size? Did they all
Pretty
follow the standard size cards?
Yeah, I mean, some of them were quart sized. The Indian painted cards, the first ones, were quart sized cards. So the smaller British standard, which went out of favor by 1903 or so, or
They're very small,
1906 in India. Yeah. But yeah, most of them were of the regular size. Yes.
I'm glad I gave you my Indian cards, Omar. I'm sure you enjoyed those.
Yes.
My Indian cards.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. It's been fun. Yes.
I've given cards to practically everybody that's in these pictures.
So can I ask you guys a question? So do any of you, have you seen these Native American leather postcards besides Dawn? I mean, you've seen them? Okay.
I have one with a big swastika on it.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I have seen leather postcards, but not
Uh-huh.
necessarily from the Native American.
Okay.
And some of them have a piece of leather in the middle of the card, like a skirt of a person or something like that.
Right.
A piece of leather. Mhm.
Yes.
And a lot of them have holes all around them because they were made into cushions.
Yeah. Oh, that's what I didn't know about that whole cushion side. That's something new for me. Thank
Sew
you.
them all together.
Okay. Yes. That's interesting. Yes.
I've got a leather card somewhere in my collection of stuff that I'll make a copy of it and send it to you. I believe it's of an Indian, and if so, I believe it was probably done by an Indian. So I'll send that along to you as soon as I'm able.
Great. I'd love to see it. I would love to see it.
Yeah.
There were a lot of American leather cards. I have a number of them with comic mosquito motifs on them.
Okay. Yeah. So that was so it was a wider tradition, correct? Yes.
And your book that you wrote was wonderful. The Indian pictures, the postcard pictures. Beautiful book.
Thank you. Thanks.
That's now about 20 years old, that book.
Well, it came out in 2018, so it's 6 years, 7 years.
Fabulous book.
Yeah.
I showed it to my various Indian neighbors.
Okay. Great. So any more thoughts or questions?
Oh, I want to say thank you very much. Very perfect presentation. Everything's so interesting. Thank you. And I want to just add that the tradition of making postcards is alive and well. For students I have who are middle school age, they really enjoy making postcards. And some of the best ones have been watercolors and collage.
Is that right?
And these kids are just very, very skilled at this, and they love doing that. So we learn history, we'll learn a subject, and then they'll make a postcard telling about that subject, showing it and telling it, and then they'll send it to a family member. And it's just a very, very great thing that I've came upon because of the club and everything, and kids really take to it. And the best ones are watercolor and collage. Yeah.
How interesting. Are you a teacher, Joe?
Yes, yes.
Ah, okay. And so what grade level is this that kids are doing this?
7 and 8. 7
Ah,
and yeah,
perfect.
yeah. So
That's-
whatever we learn I don't want to burn them out on it. We do about 4 times a year.
okay.
And
Yeah.
and I'll buy the paper, 5x8 card, and the stamps, and then they go for it.
Oh, that's so cool. There's the place actually here in San Francisco where they have like bookbinding.
Uh-huh.
People are going back to these non-digital ways of
Yeah.
communicating and stuff, which I find really quite interesting.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. It's a pleasure.
Omar, there's a question in the chat from Daniel Sachs.
Oh, let me see. Did I miss it? Oh, yes. I have 2 French stamp collages from the 19 of Halley's Comet. Do you think these could have been made in China? I don't know. So maybe, but it could have been made in France as well. I have found some nice French handmade postcards, which are pretty good with stamps. So I think so not many, but I have found a few. So I think the French may have done this as well. It's quite possible that the French may have done this as well. I mean, it's funny when we think today that France is still one of the countries where postcards are, really collected and people care about them a lot and they're expensive and so forth. So I feel that there probably would have been made in France.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it was a great presentation.
Okay.
And I was especially interested in the stamp collage cards. Because like you say, on one of them, if you tilt it just right, you can see a little bit of the glue
Oh, okay.
under the cutout of the stamp.
Okay. I will look back and try and be sure of that. Excellent.
Yeah, you see that little shine
Okay.
glue on the paper.
Excellent.
I have a stamp collage card that is actually American women's suffrage. I just assumed it was made in America, but I don't know for sure. So
Wow.
it says
Wow.
votes for women.
Oh, that's so interesting. Huh.
Yeah.
It's like a very special card. Maybe at some meeting you can share it with people. I'd love to see it. That sounds something.
I can send you a photo screenshot of it.
That'd be great. That sounds
Okay.
something really interesting. Yeah. Thank you, everybody. And Shab, I don't know if you just said anything else.
I'm absolutely thrilled that you took the time to join us and to give us this presentation. It was great, Omar, and especially doing it for a second time for our club is very special. We thank you so much.